Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for yet another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with The Moon and Sixpence by W. Somerset Maugham. This book was originally published back in 1919, and I've slowly been reading through some of the Somerset Maugham novels. This is the fourth that I've read. I've previously read Of Human Bondage, The Razor's Edge, and The Painted Veil. So this makes my fourth, The Moon and Sixpence, and I just decided to read this one because I just picked it out of his list of novels. It sounded really interesting to me, so I decided to give it a read. So what this is about is it's actually inspired by the life of the artist-painter Paul Gauguin. It is not a biographical or a historical fiction, though, but it is inspired by that artist. So, spoiler notice here, I'm not going to give away anything that I think would detract from a first-time reader's experience with this book. You may or may not know the Paul Gauguin story, so it does kind of follow some of the events, real-life events of that artist, but it is fictional, pertaining to a character whose name is Charles Strickland. Our narrator is unnamed narrator, who is a writer who comes into the orbit of Charles Strickland's family. Narrator knows Charles Strickland's wife as the novel opens and gets invited to a dinner party where he meets Charles Strickland for the first time. So Charles Strickland is a prosperous, middle-aged businessman. I think he's a stockbroker, around 40 years old, married and has a couple of kids, living this very prosperous life in England. As the novel opens, this is who he is. Something's about to happen, though, that's really going to change the fortunes of this family pretty dramatically, because Charles Strickland decides to abandon his family and go to Paris. The narrator finds out about this because, of course, news like this spreads, right, pretty quickly. And he decides to, if I remember how it all happened exactly, he decided to go and see if he could offer any real assistance to the wife. She doesn't really, so he does. So there's a lot of rumors going around about what exactly has happened, like why he's suddenly dashed off to Paris. Well, the common one, right, would be that he's run off with another woman. So that's the common narrative, but they really don't know because he just basically left this really abrupt note like, I'm leaving and goodbye. And so the wife is very distraught because this is the era. Book was written in 1919, so the events in the book take place either in the early 20th or the very late 19th century. So she's very dependent on her husband for money. She has these two kids too, right? So she's very distraught because she's not sure what she's going to do with money, because I think he's taken what money there was in savings with him. So she actually asks the narrator to go to Paris to get to the bottom of what's happened, to try to talk to Charles Strickland and convince him to come back home to his family. So the narrator does this, goes to Paris, finds Charles Strickland, meets with him, and discovers he's actually gone to Paris to start to paint and has no intention of returning and is completely indifferent to the plight of his wife or his children. He is just going to be there in Paris, and we learn that he's not schooled in painting. He's never been trained as a painter. We learn really early right here in this interaction that he had wanted to pursue this as a young man, and his father had not let him do it. And so he's 40 now, and he decided now was the time. He was either going to do it or never. He was never going to do it. So the narrator returns back to England and reports this to the wife. She, needless to say, in a way, she kind of, I think, wanted him to have run off with a woman, because that's something she could have understood. Nobody in their prosperous middle class orbit really understands someone giving up their entire life and causing this level of disruption for the sake of being an unproven artist. So eventually the narrator does return back to France for a different reason, but when he's there, he actually comes across Charles Strickland again and renews that connection, then which he keeps up more or less throughout the rest of the book, because this is how we know the story, right? Because we're getting told the story by the narrator. And I won't go into exactly what all happened here as far as the details of Charles Strickland's life in Paris, other than to say he's basically a starving artist. He's not a successful artist when the narrator returns to France at all. He is living in basically abject poverty. So just some thoughts. The first one that I jotted down here is the theme of the indulgence of the genius creative. Because Charles Strickland here, he has this best friend, this Dutch painter who's a successful but yet mediocre painter who sees a genius in Charles Strickland. Of course, he's not selling any paintings because the people who see the paintings, they are, I think a lot of times when someone is a painter, like a revolutionary painter in a whole new way, the average person doesn't understand those paintings at first. For example, Van Gogh, was not successful during his life because people didn't understand what he was doing at the actual time he was creating those works. And so, but this friend, this long-suffering friend, really admires Strickland and tries to help him all he can. And Charles Strickland is actually a very terrible person. He's completely doesn't care anything I mentioned already. He didn't really care what happened to his wife financially or his kids, if they got an education or not. He just basically abandoned them completely. And he also is not a good friend. This Dutch painter tries to be a good friend to him and help him, and he treats him terribly and dismisses him and humiliates him in multiple ways that I won't go into here. But he's just not Charles Strickland is not a likable person at all. And this kind of reminded me of a book called Creating Minds, An Anatomy of Creativity as Seen Through the Lives of Einstein, Stravinsky, Eliot, Graham, and Gandhi by Howard Gardner. And this was taking a look at these types of creative personalities and how they are often very difficult to live with because they really see the world through the lens of whatever sort of focus they have. So either an artistic focus or a scientific focus or a philosophical focus or something like that in the case of this book. Our main character, Charles Strickland, only cares about painting. He doesn't care if he sells them or not. He just wants to create them and feels like driven to do that. And then there are certain people, the narrator, but definitely his friend, the Dutch painter, to a lesser extent, the narrator, do also see this in him somewhat and try to help him, at least get him some food once in a while and things like that. The second sort of main theme that I think that I jotted down is the tension between conformity and non-conformity, and that experience of reading, the experience of the reader seeing this, because like I said, Charles Strickland is not likable at all. So he's not sympathetic. So the reader, I was not compelled to like him. And then I'm reading a novel, so I'm not seeing his artworks, right? So I'm not indulging him. I'm being told he's a genius, but I'm not seeing the works themselves. And so it was really sort of a challenge to take a look at this type of creative person and then react to them as the reader, right? Not indulging them as a genius because I don't know what they created, but just trying to look at them as a person, saying like, yeah, okay, he can be a genius, but does he have to be such a jerk, But there's a few quotes here that I think really illustrate this tension between conformity and nonconformity. Charles Strickland, our main character here, is a strict nonconformist, meaning he's not conforming to societal customs at all. First quote says, unconsciously perhaps, we treasure the power we have over people by their regard for our opinion of them, and we hate those upon whom we have no such influence. So, that's the thing about Charles Strickland here in The Reader. Charles Strickland doesn't care what you think of him. He doesn't care if you think he's a bad person. He doesn't care what you think. He's only really focused on his own work, and that's it. And then, we have the society has this, expects to be able to put pressure on people to get them to conform. And then there's some people that come along, like this main character, that has no effect on whatsoever. There's another quote here. It says, "But here was a man who sincerely did not mind what people thought of him, and so convention had no hold on him. He was like a wrestler whose body is oiled. You could not get a grip on him. It gave him a freedom which was an outrage. I remember saying to him, 'Look here, if everyone acted like you, the world couldn't go on.' And then he replies, 'That's a damn silly thing to say. Everyone doesn't want to act like me.'" So he's like, it gave him a certain freedom, because then once he shed all of this society's expectations of what he should be doing, how he should be behaving, he could then focus on his own work. And this sort of self-actualization, I think, is showed kind of in an extreme here, but nevertheless, sometimes a person, in order to become the person they want, to do the things they want to do, really have to put that barrier up. Finally, I'll end this chat with this quote that's talking about how we can't really ever know another person. And this is the thing about reading this book, is that we don't really actually ever know the interior world of Charles Strickland. We only see his behavior to others, and then we get informed that he is a artistic, creative genius. We don't actually know anything about his interior world. And ultimately, this quote is talking about that. It says, "Each one of us is alone in the world. He is shut in a tower of brass and can communicate with his fellows only by signs. And the signs have no common value, so that their sense is vague and uncertain. We seek pitifully to convey to others the treasures of our heart, but they have not the power to accept them. And so we go lonely, side by side, but not together, unable to know our fellows and unknown by them. We are like people living in a country whose language they know so little that, with all manner of beautiful and profound things to say, they are condemned to the banalities of the conversation manual. Their brain is seething with ideas, and they can only tell you that the umbrella of the gardener's aunt is in the house." So I think this, in the case of Charles Strickland, is conveying his inner world through his art. Definitely not through his verbal communication, but that imagery of how we are limited and how we can express our inner worlds to each other is, I think, very cool. So you can't really express these your complex inner world to anybody else, and so therefore you're just sort of in there alone. I thought that was really interesting. Okay, I think I will leave the chat with that. I did enjoy this book a lot. This will not be the last of the Somerset Maugham novels that I read. I will pick one out, definitely at least one, to get to next year, if not two. So my next chat is going to be Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. I have finished this already, and I will have a chat on this coming up very soon. So until next time, take care.